Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. Today, I'm here with the Byzantine Scotist. We are going to be talking about the philosophy of John Duns Scotus. And so I'll have my guest introduce himself real quick and tell us about how you got into Scotism and this philosophy.
Yeah, I'm the Byzantine Scotist. You can find me on YouTube with that name. And yeah, so I was raised not a Christian, a sort of non-religious Jewish family. And then in high school, I really was an atheist, and I was a very hardcore atheist. Like I thought like religion should be banned, at least teaching it to children should be banned and stuff. And then I came across the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus by reading a number of books and talking with people. And I was like, well, I'm going to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Then I felt like I was compelled to become a Christian by the evidence. And so I started looking into different churches. Where should I go to like explore this whole Christianity thing? And I got into it from this historical perspective, and I discovered there was this whole historical tradition of the church fathers. So that sort of always ruled out Protestantism for me. That never really had a strong pull that way. But I did feel a strong pull to the Orthodox Church because it felt like Catholics, when they talked about tradition, it sort of started with Thomas Aquinas, and there wasn't anything before that, maybe Augustine. And so I know that, of course, it's a really biased view, but that was sort of my impression from browsing the internet for a few minutes. And in high school, I considered that good research. And so I visited a Greek Orthodox church near me, really fell in love with the liturgy, and I ended up getting baptized into the Orthodox Church. But I got lots of Catholic friends along the way. I went to a Catholic college, and that got me to keep looking into this issue more. And there was many things that brought me over to the Catholic Church, but one of the things actually was Scotism, because Scotism answered one of my major arguments, which was the essence energies distinction. And I would sort of use that to bash Catholics over the head with, oh, you guys don't have this. I now know that the whole issue is a lot more complex than I was making it out to be, but I sort of acted like every church father believed that, and then Thomas Aquinas threw it out. I know, of course, is not the actual picture of what happened, but I watched a interview with Dr. Jared Goff on Reason and Theology, where he was discussing how Scotus can actually be used to answer a lot of the concerns that Palamites have. Because one of the things that Scotus introduces, and what I really grasped at that time, was the formal distinction, that there's sort of a middle distinction in between a real distinction and a conceptual distinction that allows us to talk about two things as not being identical, but also not really being separable, that we can't really conceive of one without the other. And I think if you go and closely read Palamos, this is actually a lot closer to what Palamos is trying to get at than I think even a lot of modern Palamite interpreters, who want to act like there's sort of two substances in God. There's the essence and then the energies, as though these are two substances. Now, I know that a Palamite's going to want to back away as soon as they hear that phrasing of it, but I think that's the sense you can get a lot of the time. But I think if we get that when we're talking about each activity of God, I think that's really a better translation than energy. We get how each one, God is fully present in each of his activities, but each one can't simply be reduced to all the others. And each one is a distinct mode of that one operation of God. And I think that this is a much better way of looking at the whole situation. And that sort of knocked down, was really, in my mind at that point, one of the last objections I had against Catholicism. And it really, after this point, my only objections left were the Filioque and then papal authority. So of course it comes along, I discover that Scotus also has an answer to the Filioque issues. Because in St. Thomas, and I want to clarify, just to get things off the bat, that when I'm saying there's this issue in St. Thomas, the vast majority of what St. Thomas wrote, I really love. This is not meant to say Thomas are dumb, like Thomas is bad. These are particular issues I have with Thomas on very minor points, I think. But with the Filioque, Thomas wants to say, basically, if you deny the Filioque, you've basically denied the Trinity, because then there's no way to distinguish the Son and the Spirit. And they're each then proceeding from one person, and so they must be the same person. Now we only have two persons in the Trinity, and therefore the Trinity has been denied. But this to me really seemed absurd if you've read the Fathers, because this totally goes against the logic that the Cappadocians lay out, that begetting and procession are not the same thing. And St. Gregory Nazianzen actually brings up the Eunomian objection that these are really the same thing. And Gregory of Nazianzen's response is, if you want to know what begotten means, tell me what it means for the Father to be unbegotten, and we'll both go mad trying to figure this out. But this is something of the essence of God. And so we can't, in our finite minds, figure out what that means really. All we can know is that there is a difference. I come to find out that Bonaventure and Scotus actually draw that same conclusion, but they also take the important step of realizing that that doesn't mean the Filioque isn't true. Because really, we don't have this communion of three persons eternally unless there is a relation between the Son and the Spirit. And I think furthermore, if you want to say that the West departed in 1054, you have to say that at least the majority of what was written in the West before 1054, especially over 500 years before that, it has to be somewhat orthodox, you know? And you have Augustine there writing about the Filioque 600 years before the schism. And it's not like Augustine wrote this down and it wasn't that important. No, this was the standard Trinitarian work in the West. Everyone who was in the West at this point followed Augustine's Trinitarian theology. So I think we have to take these two truths in at the same time, that we have begetting and procession aren't the same thing, but that the Spirit does proceed from both the Father and the Son. And I think the answer is really just found there in Augustine himself, that there's a difference in the role of the Father and the Son in procession, that we can sort of say, we often say the Spirit is the love between the Father and the Son, but I think we can clarify in even more detail that the Spirit is really the love of the Father towards the Son, and then the Son's love of the Father back to him. And you actually find a very similar thing within Gregory Palamas himself in the 150 chapters. He admits an eternal relation between the Spirit and the Son. And that relation is one of love. I've seen some scholars think that actually Augustine's De Trinitate must have been translated into Greek shortly before this, because you don't find it in any earlier Byzantines. And so of course, Palamas still rejects the Filioque. He wrote a whole work against it. But I think then we have to ask, do the objections of the Filioque still stack up here? And I think there's two tendencies in the East and West to go too far the other direction. You have a tendency in the West, I think, that to basically say what Thomas does, that there's really no relation between begetting and procession, and that the Spirit's difference is that he proceeds from two. And then you have a tendency in the East to deny any eternal relation between the Son and the Spirit, because they want to push back against the Filioque and say that there's only a temporal sending. And it's really not outside of obscure scholarly works that you will find something in the Orthodox world talking about the eternal relationship of the Son and the Spirit. I know there is that book on what was it, the Council of Blockernay, which talks about this. I know there are people who do talk about this within the Orthodox Church. Staniloae has some really excellent material on it from an Orthodox perspective, but this really, I think, can't be said to be the mainstream Orthodox perspective this day. The mainstream Orthodox perspective is that there is no eternal relationship between the Son and the Spirit. That's what I found basically everywhere I was looking. So if you have these two extreme tendencies there, which both of them you can say neither of them are the dogmatic stance of their church, which tendency is worse? And I think the tendency to deny any eternal relationship between the Son and the Spirit is actually a much worse tendency, because now we don't have an eternal communion of three persons. And furthermore, we can't say that the economic Trinity reveals the immanent Trinity, that you can't say anymore that God's odd extra actions, that the Son sending the Spirit reveals something eternally about the Trinity anymore. But we can only know the Trinity by its revelation into the world. These relations are the essence of God, so we can't know them by natural reason. And so we're essentially destroying our relationship between God's revelation and how God actually is. And so I think you really need the words Filioque there in the creed to go against that tendency. And so I found that very, very convincing. And papal authority isn't really related to Scotism, so I will sidestep that for now. But yeah, that's basically how I got interested in Scotism, is seeing that it really answered my objections from an Orthodox perspective. And very, very quickly after finding out about Scotism, I ended up becoming Catholic, because I had already been moving in that direction, but this sort of knocked down my main objections to it. You know, that I had been convinced on a lot of stuff, but I was like, but there's still these dogmatic issues, and I can make a strong case for the Orthodox perspective over the Catholic one. And once that's gone, then there's really nothing keeping me from Catholicism. But once I became Catholic, I had sort of been always interested in Scotism. At that, it was sort of in the back of my mind, but it didn't really become a focus for a while. I got very interested in issues of political theology and integralism, so I sort of moved over to that and didn't focus on Scotism for a while, until I was talking with some of these colleagues I had made with integralist issues, and I brought up Scotism. And I found these Thomists immediately having a very, very negative reaction to any arguments of Scotus. And my argument I was bringing up with Scotus is the absolute primacy of Christ, something I can go into in a minute, but it's one of Scotus's main arguments. And I actually thought it really defended very well a sort of integralist position. But what I found is they didn't like it, not because there wasn't some argument that I could make for it, but because it's not in Thomas. And if you're not in Thomas, you know, even though Thomas's teacher, Albertus Magnus, comes up with it, that it's not in Thomas, so we really just have to totally ignore it. But so that really got me re-energized with wanting to just research Scotisms. I sort of knew these points here and there, but I didn't know it as a whole system. And I also read some of Ed Feser, and Ed Feser's objections to Scotism did seem pretty plausible to me. And these were on philosophical issues. And I'm really more interested in theology than philosophy. And so his philosophical objections seemed pretty convincing to me. Then I got this book. I have a number of Scotist books next to me, which I want to talk about and recommend. This book here, it's called The Theologian of Auschwitz by Father Peter Damian Fellner. And I got a copy of this book. It actually was on a wish list, and my wife bought it for me. And I started reading through it. And it presents an entire vision of the world through a Scotist lens. And that's what really got me reinvigorated with wanting to research Scotism more. And I think that's what really set me on the track to where I am now, of wanting to see how Scotism fits together as a coherent system.
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful introduction to Scotus and even your personal journey. So before we get into kind of the deeper nitty-gritty of the philosophy, so to speak, I am interested in kind of asking you two questions. The first is, in the Byzantine Catholic community, how common would you say it is for people to be fans of Scotus over Aquinas? And then the second question is, what works of Scotus or books about Scotus would you recommend?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people in the Byzantine Catholic world don't know about Scotus, or if they do, I've actually noticed there is much more of an openness within the Byzantine Catholic world for Scotus. And I think that's partly because a number of people have been promoting this thesis that I'm also convinced on, of the use of Scotus within ecumenical dialogue with the Orthodox world. And that Scotus does a much better job, I think, of bringing in a lot of the Eastern patristic tradition into his thought. But I actually want to point out that at the main Byzantine Catholic seminary in the US, St. Cyril and Methodius, the main rector there, Father Christian Capes, is very influenced by Scotism. I know he says he won't call himself a Scotist, but he's basically borderline a Scotist. And then one of the professors there, Dr. Jared Goff, is also a very, very committed Thomist, not Thomist, rather Scotist. Dr. Jared Goff has really influenced me a lot. I've talked with him a number of times. And so, yeah, I think within the Byzantine Catholic seminaries, it seems like there's this growth of Scotus, and hopefully that trickles down to some of the priests and then ultimately the parishioners.
And yeah, and then the second question was, you know, what books or writings of Scotus or about Scotus would you recommend?
Oh, yeah. So I actually don't recommend starting with Scotus himself.
Yeah.
And that's because Scotus is very, very scholastic.
Yeah.
This is the peak of the scholastic tradition. He will go on for 20 pages talking about other people's views before he even begins to lay out his own. And this can drive people up the wall. They think that Scotus is this great rationalist. There's nothing mystical about Scotus. It's a complete waste of your time to read Scotus. But I think that that's really not at all the case. I think Scotus actually presents this really beautiful vision of all of reality. And so I think you have to take a step back and read some of the secondary literature on Scotus to get there. And I think the reason you have this a little bit is that we often think Scotus wrote and there's Scotism and that's sort of it. But before quite recently, there was actually a whole manualist tradition of Scotus. So you wouldn't just read Scotus, you would also read these great commentators like Frassen and Minguez and all these other ones that are unfortunately just in Latin. So I won't recommend them here just because I assume most of the viewers don't know Latin. But if you know Latin, there's a lot of wonderful stuff about Scotus out there. And so, yeah, people weren't reading directly from Scotus most of the time. And so they were getting his ideas in this greater vision. And so I think that we need to take that step back. But since the classical works aren't translated in English, there's a number of great English works. So the first one I want to recommend, I don't have a physical copy, I just have it in PDF, is Nothing for Your Journey by Ephraim Batoni. And this is a really wonderful book, but I think it shows the vision of how the Franciscans viewed themselves. So John Duns Scotus is a Franciscan theologian. And the Franciscans historically didn't just read Scotus, but they also read Bonaventure. And it's often argued in a lot of modern literature that Scotus and Bonaventure are just worlds apart, which is ridiculous because everyone who focused on Scotus and Bonaventure historically, all the Franciscans, didn't see a big departure between them. They thought on most issues they're actually in agreement and are just phrasing things in different ways. And this is, I think, Ephraim Batoni lays out a good approach where he takes some major topics within Franciscan theology. And he starts off with talking about the example of St. Francis. How does St. Francis exemplify this virtue in his life? How does he exemplify the freedom of the will? How does he exemplify this care for nature? Then he moves on to Bonaventure and talks about how Bonaventure takes this life of St. Francis and brings it into a theological system, which is this great, beautiful, poetic system. And then he moves on to Scotus and sort of how does Scotus develop this and bring it into a much more sort of metaphysically rigorous system and develop it. And I think that's a great book for looking at the continuity of Franciscan theology and also some of the main topics of it. So that's a great one to start off with. And it's often ignored now just because it's out of print and it's a little obscure nowadays, but I think that's really wonderful. And Father Ephraim Batoni studied at the Franciscan seminaries. He might have been at the Seraphicum, I'm not sure. That's sort of the Franciscan equivalent of the Angelicum. But I know he studied at least some of them, where he was learned from this long manualist tradition of Scotus. And that's a big advantage that a lot of modern writers don't have, is they're approaching this from a very scholarly perspective and they don't have the living tradition. But Father Ephraim Batoni really has that living tradition. Then if you want to dive into particular, before I dive into particular topics also, if you're interested in more of the philosophy, I highly recommend The Philosophical Vision of John Duns Scotus by Mary Beth Ingham. That's a really wonderful to some of the more philosophical issues like the primacy of the will and his view of contingency and issues like that. But if you're not trained in philosophy at all, I think that one could be very confusing. So now some other books I want to recommend. This one is Primer on the Absolute Primacy of Christ by Maximilian Mary Dean. This is a really wonderful book, and it's only, how many pages is it here? Like 100, and it's like little tiny pages. So it's a really quick read, and it goes through basically Scotus's doctrine of the absolute primacy of Christ, which we can go into in a minute. We talk about the actual doctrines. But he sort of lays out what does it mean, what are Scotus's writings on the matter. He just collects a bunch. He collects a bunch of patristic writings on the topic. And then he collects some major quotes from St. Paul that defend the view, and he exegetes them in a lot of detail. And this is really highly recommended here. I really recommend this book. There's actually a blog that it was turned into by the same author. And the blog basically covers everything the book does. And then if you like listening more, he made a YouTube series that also covers the entire book. So you can just listen to it on YouTube if you want to as well.
Yeah. Would you recommend your own YouTube channel?
I've just started out. I only have a little bit of stuff on it. But yeah, there's a lot of wonderful stuff out there. If you want to listen more, I highly recommend the YouTube channel of Jared Goff. If you go to my YouTube channel, you'll see in the bottom, he has a bunch of basically seminary lectures that he's recorded and just posted on his YouTube for free. And then the other great one for Scotus content is just Franciscan Friars. It's all one word. It's the YouTube channel, the Franciscan Friars of the Immaculate, and they have a lot of really wonderful stuff on there about Scotus. They did a really wonderful recent series, which is a set of homilies on the divine attributes that goes into a lot of detail. I learned a lot by listening to that. So I highly recommend those two YouTube channels. Some more books to recommend here. I have the Mariology of John Duns Scotus by Father Ruggero Rosini. Of course, Scotus is probably most famously known. The only thing you'll see a lot of Thomists sort of admit he was right on was the Immaculate Conception. But this shows that Scotus's theology of the Immaculate Conception does not end with the Immaculate Conception. This is like 300 pages on Scotus's theology of Mary. And he has a very, very detailed theology of Mary, that Mary was predestined with Christ in one and the same decree. And so basically, this is actually goes through almost every topic of Scotist theology and shows you how it relates to Mary, that God eternally predestines the Incarnation and the Immaculate Conception. And he even predestines the Immaculate Conception apart from sins. We can talk about that. What does it mean for Mary to be immaculately conceived if the fall never happened? But Scotus defends that that Mary would be. And so this is a really wonderful book on really every topic of Scotus theology through the lens of Mary. And this is, I don't know why, for some reason I've noticed this trend recently of Protestants calling themselves Scotus, which makes no sense if you actually read Scotus, because Mary is so central to everything he writes. The last main book I want to recommend here is Caritas and Primo by Jared Goff. This one's actually on Bonaventure, but Jared Goff is trained in the Scotist tradition, and so he's able to show the continuity at many points between Bonaventure and Scotus. And this is on really the Trinitarian theology of St. Bonaventure, which really just follows through with Scotist Trinitarian theology as well. And it also talks really heavily about the reception of Aristotle within the Franciscan tradition in Bonaventure, that Bonaventure doesn't reject Aristotle altogether, and he uses a lot of writings from Aristotle. Ironically, the work he uses most commonly is the Liber de Causis, which isn't even actually by Aristotle. But he does use Aristotle a lot. He's one of the most cited authors within Bonaventure. But the way he takes Aristotle, he sort of has a freedom to take Aristotle where he wants to go, rather than feeling really tied down to Aristotle. And I think this is a really wonderful book on both the Trinity and the reception of Aristotle. And so those are sort of the main ones to talk about. One last one I could quickly bring up here is The Theology of History in Bonaventure by Joseph Ratzinger, who famously became Pope Benedict. And this was his dissertation on the Bonaventure's view of history. And while Scotus writes nothing on the topic, I actually think this meshes really well with what's in Scotus. And St. Maximilian Kolbe, who's a really great Scotist, takes a lot of what Bonaventure does and ties it together with Scotus, and then also ties it together with the Immaculate Conception. And yeah, we can talk about all those topics in the next section. But yeah, I think those are some really wonderful works. One more last book. Sorry, listing off a bunch of books here. But I think The Transcendentals and Their Function in the Metaphysics of Duns Scotus by Alan Walter is really excellent, because it shows clearly what Scotus actually means by the univocity of being. And that's one of the most misunderstood things in Scotus. So I highly recommend that book. And it's free on archive.org, actually, because it's out of print. So that's very useful.
Yeah, well, let's, so there's a lot of things that I'm interested in talking about. Like, for instance, the absolute primacy of Christ, the univocity of being, the formal distinction. All these things are really interesting. But suppose that, like for me, I'm not very well, I'll admit, I'm not very well educated in the philosophy of John Duns Scotus. Most of what I've heard about him was through people who are commenting maybe critically on his work, right? And so I never felt like I really got a nice feel for what he actually defends or upholds. And so if you're introducing, Scotism to somebody, where would you start? How would you, what's the groundwork that you need?
Yeah, I think I would start with the absolute primacy of Christ, which in my YouTube series is not actually where I started, because I started trying to build up a foundation to where we are. But I think if you wanted to sort of catch someone's interest, I think the absolute primacy of Christ is really the place to start. Because this, for Scotus, is sort of the main doctrine of everything. So the absolute primacy of Christ is essentially the idea that even if the fall had never happened, God still would have become incarnate as man. And this is not merely, a lot of people think that when Thomas disagrees with Scotus on it, this is sort of up in the air. And for Thomas, it is sort of up in the air. Thomas thinks it can really go either way. It doesn't really make a big difference. But for Scotus, this makes all the difference, because this is the main reason behind everything. So he says that God wills in the first instant, an instant here being merely analogical. We're not talking about actual periods of time, but in a logical order. God wills first the incarnation, and then he wills the means for it, which is all of creation. Because the incarnation is God's greatest work. And so if he wills anything first, it must be his greatest work, which is the incarnation. And then he wills the world for the incarnation. So we all exist for the sake of Christ, rather than Christ primarily becoming man for our sake. And so I think that when you flip that order there, everything in the world starts making sense, because the entire world is this created image of Christ. And so when he becomes human in the incarnation, it sort of perfects what the entire creation had set up to be. And also in this one decree, this actually makes it into Pius IX's dogma of the Immaculate Conception, that the Immaculate Conception is willed in one and the same decree with Christ. And so if Christ then is willed apart from sin, then Mary is willed apart from sin. So even Mary is willed to become the mother of God, even if there was no sin in the world. And then also the church, that all the faithful of the church were also willed to be, if even apart from the fall. And Scotus sort of leaves open the question then, well, what about the damned? And he sort of doesn't touch that question of what would have happened to them if not for the fall. But essentially, I think the most important idea to take here is that God's plan cannot be thwarted by sin, that God ultimately is victorious in the end, because the incarnation and then everything that follows from the incarnation of the church and the Immaculate Conception is ultimately then going to happen no matter what. And so this was the original plan. Sin sort of only sets things off track a little bit, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So I remember you kind of said that you were more into theology than philosophy, right? Mm-hmm. And so I like how that's a very theological point. I mean, obviously it has philosophical inner workings, but I think, basically anybody could appreciate the point that's being made. So I'm interested in then, what was Scotus's reasoning for saying that the greatest work would be willed first, right? Logically speaking.
So that actually comes from Aristotle, that Aristotle has that a orderly willer wills first the end and then the means for the end.
Yeah, that's right.
And so if the ends is Christ, he must will first Christ, even before sin comes into the equation.
I see. That's really good. Okay, yeah. That makes sense if you understand final causality, right?
Yeah, and I think there's another great argument for the absolute primacy that doesn't come from Scotus, but comes from Maximus the Confessor, where Maximus the Confessor talks about basically that the entire world is this created image of Christ through the Logos. So Christ is the Logos, and there's the many logi, the rational principles of things that are all eternally present within Christ. And so this world is this created image of Christ. And so basically then the reason that is because the final perfection of the world is in the incarnation. I don't want to get too derailed on Maximus. I'd love to talk about Maximus sometime all day. And I think there's a really close connection between a lot of what Maximus is talking about in Scotus. We can focus on Scotus here.
Yeah, and then when you were talking about the premise, the absolute primacy of Christ, it kind of reminded me of Colossians 1:17, right? Where it says, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. That kind of fits really well with this picture, then, that like the creation is, so to speak, an icon of Christ.
Yeah, and this is actually one of the verses that Maximilian Meridean in his book brings up to defend the absolute primacy. And I think if you read through his interpretation of those verses in Colossians and his interpretation of Ephesians 1, there's really no way to escape the absolute primacy as being the biblical doctrine. Here, it's so clear in St. Paul if you really look closely at those passages. And I think those are always great places to start. And what's wonderful about the verse in Colossians is St. Paul then goes on to discuss basically a recapitulation theory of the atonement. And I think that that's closely tied to this absolute primacy, that the world is reheaded from being under Adam to being under Christ, and that glorification of the world from Adam to Christ would have needed to happen, even if not for the fall. But since Adam sinned and brought death into the world, there now needs to be a death to bring it back. So it's not, the crucifixion is only the result of sin, but the incarnation is willed no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So since we've talked about the absolute primacy of Christ, I'm interested in getting now into kind of, the kind of more metaphysical side of things, right? So the univocity of being and the formal distinction, right? These are kind of two big topics, but is there anything else that you want to say about the absolute primacy of Christ?
I think that's a basic introduction to it. I highly recommend Maximilian Mary Dean's work on it. He's done such a good job defending it in a contemporary context. And so.
All right, yeah. So so when we're deciding between talking about the univocity of being or the formal distinction, what would you recommend talking about first, or does the order not really matter?
I think the univocity of being is important to discuss first.
Okay, sure. Then go ahead. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I first need to set up what classically is talked about. So when the fathers and St. Thomas and St. Bonaventure as well talk about God, there's a main problem. So in classical philosophy, we can either use a word univocally or equivocally, right? So when you use a word univocally, you're using it in the same sense, right? So if I say that I'm a human and you're a human, we're saying that we're both humans, right? And so we're using the word human in the same sense there. Well, let's say we want to say, right, Tom Hanks is a star, the sun is a star. We're not using the word star in the same sense there. So that's an equivocal use of the word star because we're using those for two totally different meanings. And this is important when we get to logic. So when we get to logic, for example, we can't say a star is an exploding ball of gas. Tom Hanks is a star. Therefore, Tom Hanks is an exploding ball of gas. That's an invalid syllogism. And the reason it's invalid is because the word star is being used equivocally there. And versus if we say Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal, we're using the word man univocally there. So a word has to be used univocally in order for it to be useful in logic. Now we get to metaphysics. And in metaphysics, we bring in a sort of third category, which is analogy, when a word is used in a related way, but not in the same way, right? So when I say my dad is, I call him father, and if I call my priest father, we're not saying that they're the father in the same way. The priest didn't biologically beget me, but they both have this sort of authority over me, and they have this nurturing role over me. And so we use the word father in a similar sense. And so we say there's an analogy there. There's a similarity there. And so now we're getting to an issue of how do we talk about God? Right? God is infinite and he's beyond us. And so the fathers and St. Thomas want to make clear when we talk about God, we're only using analogy, right? So when I say that I love something because it is good, versus God loves something causes it to be good because God imbues his love within that thing through loving it. And so there's a different sense in which the word love is used there. And this is a big discussion of how is the analogy work out? That's a constant discussion that's going on. So now we get to the late 1200s and we get to a theologian named Henry of Ghent. And Henry of Ghent realizes that analogy is really just a form of equivocation, right? So I can't say a father biologically begets his son, a priest is a father, therefore a priest biologically begets his son, even though the word father is used analogously in both situations. We put it into a syllogism, it's invalid. And so analogy is really just equivocation, but that's with a similarity. But when we go to logic, there's only two categories in logic. There's univocity and equivocity. And so Henry of Ghent says that we actually don't know anything about God. When we use all these terms, we're really just equivocating about God, and we're not actually saying anything about God. Now, this is a big issue because historically, people wanted to deny equivocity. This is a heresy that you say you can't know anything about God. And so Scotist comes on the scene in response to this, and I actually think a really brilliant way. That Scotist says analogy is not pure equivocity. Analogy is both univocity and equivocity in a combined way. So take, for example, I think St. Thomas gives a really wonderful illustration of analogy in the Summa. This is Prima Pars, question 13, I think article 5, where he says, let's take the word healthy, right? We can talk about an animal being healthy, and that means it's physically doing well, and the healthiness is proper to it. We also, though, will say, we'll talk about a healthy medicine, that the medicine causes the health within the animal. And that we then have healthy urine, that if we want to test whether the animal's healthy, we might test its urine to see if certain diseases are there. And so we can then say, if the urine comes out and shows there's no problems with the animal, that's a healthy urine. Well, does that mean the urine is physically doing well, or that the medicine is physically doing well? No, it's that they're all related to one common thing. The one common thing is the well-being of the animal. So healthiness is in the animal as its own well-being. It's in the medicine as a cause, and it's in the urine as a sign. And so there's a common term here, and the common term is being related to in different modes. And this is what Scotus is essentially pointing out, as he says, when we talk about God, if we want it to be analogy, there has to be a common term in which we're relating it to. Now, what is that common term? Scotus says that this common term is the concept of being. So we have this concept of being within our mind, and being for Scotus is that simply which is not repugnant to be. So basically being is that which is simply not non-being. It's a sort of apophatic definition of being. And so we then want to say, right, that humans and God, when we talk about them, the way we have analogy is that they're related to this common concept of being. So being as such doesn't actually exist on its own. I don't mean here to say that God isn't being himself, but being as in this concept of not non-being. It doesn't actually exist. It only exists within things. And so when we form it in our mind, it's this universal concept we come up with. And Scotus has something he actually draws from Bonaventure here called the disjunctive transcendentals, which are essentially the division of being into different categories. And categories, using that word loosely here, right? So we say God is infinite and we're finite. God is prior to all things. We're posterior to God. God is simple. We're composed. And you can go on and on and on with, I think Walter finds in this book, The Transcendentals, finds, I think, 16 different disjunctive transcendentals in Scotus, and then a 17th one in Bonaventure. So we have at least 17 of these that we figured out. There's probably a lot more there if you just stop and think about it. And so this is the division of things. So God is pure actuality. He's uncaused, he's infinite, he's unparticipated, and we have all of those, but to a lesser degree. So we're potential, we're finite, we're caused, we have participated being. And so that's what Scotus means by the univocity of being. He doesn't mean that God is simply a being among beings. This is an argument often made by what's called the radical orthodoxy movement, which has basically said that Scotus set up basically theistic personalism by saying that God is an infinite being and therefore God must just be a being among beings. If you read Scotus, that's clearly not what he means by God being an infinite being. He means that basically if we talk about this concept of being, God is related to it in an infinite mode and we're related to it in a finite mode. And I just want to bring up here, since I brought up the radical orthodoxy movement, the head of the radical orthodoxy movement has admitted to me that he hasn't even read Walter on this, and he thinks Walter is outdated. So they're clearly not a reliable source on Scotism. And so, yeah, you have this, so univocity within Scotus here is not denying analogy. It's giving an underlying meaning to what analogy is and actually makes analogy real analogy. And I think this solves the issues you have within the classical tradition of analogy. And while Scotus is accused of departing from the tradition of analogy, I actually think that Scotus is the one who gives us the way to defend analogy against critiques of it.
Yeah, so then could you briefly re-articulate what the definition of the univocity of being is? Just very clearly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, I went in a whole line there to explain how Scotus gets to this, but the essential idea is that we form in our mind a concept of being, which is simply not to be. Yeah. So simply it's to be. And that we can then have we then have this concept in our mind. It doesn't actually exist. It's only in our mind. And then God and creatures are related to it, but in different ways. So God is related to an infinite, uncaused, unparticipated, fully actual, and we're caused, finite, potential. And so these are the two different ways in which we relate to this common concept of to be.
Okay, so then just to kind of back up and make sure I'm understanding it properly too. So there's this concept that we have, right, of being. And so in a sense, then, like, he is reaffirming actually analogy, right, with these clarifications in mind. And so with analogy, it's the case that, like, I don't know, the word or whatever we're referring to is in a sense in both of the things in question, but also not. There's a distinction, right?
Yeah, and so we can make syllogisms of God in certain senses, right? So if we want to say all beings are either finite or infinite, God is a being, therefore God is either finite or infinite, that would be a fair analogy, right? But we can't say we can't talk about being on its own. So if we want to actually talk about beings, we have to either clarify finite or infinite, right? So if we want to say I can't think of a syllogism off the top of my head,
Sure,
but you get the basic idea you get there, is that you have to talk of either finite or infinite. And I want to briefly mention here one objection to Univocity, which is that it places God within a genus, and here the genus would be being. And so obviously that would then be heretical. But the simple answer to that is that being exists before the categories, right? So if we want to talk about the categories, the substance, quality, quantity, any of these are all things predicated of being. And so we first have to divide being in either finite or infinite, and then we can talk about the categories. And so the categories are only things that talk about finite being, because they have to talk about some degree of potentiality to them in order for them to be distinguished as categories.
So would a Scotus be okay then if we said that God is just like pure being or reality itself? Would that be okay for him?
I think he would be okay with that. I've never run across that phrase from him, but I can't see anything he would necessarily object to in it. The phrase he tends to prefer is an infinite being, ens infinitum.
Yeah. So why do you think that, oh, sorry, I just wanted to ask, you know, you brought up the point that a lot of Protestants identify as Scotus, and I guess in part the reason why is because, as you pointed out, some of them believe that this lends the doctrine of a view of theistic personalism, right? But your response is that, that's not necessarily the case. And so what would you say about Scotus does not lead to theistic personalism?
Yeah, I think that Scotus is actually sort of our response to theistic personalism, is we're dialoguing with theistic personalists. A common objection is that we're just talking about word salad, that we want to have this category of analogy, but we can never explain what this category of analogy actually is in practice. And I think Scotus actually gives us an answer to them. And I think a lot of people want to think that everything was going along fine, everyone was a Thomist, and then Scotus comes along and messes everything up. But really, we don't get these people strongly identifying as Thomists until after Scotus is dead. It's not till really the Renaissance and the Counter-Reformation that we get this really strong hardcore Thomism. You can't disagree with anything Thomas said. Here's the points of Thomism. That doesn't really even come about by Scotus's day. There's a lot more diversity within Scotus's day. And we have to look at some of the other players on the scene, like Henry of Ghent or Giles of Rome or William of Ockham. And just simply because Scotus might have some similar terminology to them doesn't mean he's the cause of everything here.
Yeah, well, let me see here. So I'm now interested in talking about the formal distinction, and especially in relation to Scotus's view of the doctrine of divine simplicity, because some people have talked about how if you have the formal distinction, then this can actually deal with a lot of issues that people have with the Thomistic conception of divine simplicity. So can you talk about just first the formal distinction, and then we'll get into simplicity?
Yeah. So Thomistic distinctions, as I understand them through Ed Feser, I know some people dispute Ed Feser's categorization of some of them. He wants to divide things fundamentally into conceptual distinctions and real distinctions. And that real distinctions are those which actually exist separable, which are actually distinct from one another before the mind's conception of them, and that conceptual things are only when the mind thinks about them. And then he wants to say within conceptual distinctions, There's two of them. There's ones that are just purely logical, that we would say, for example, the distinction between Bill Clinton and the 42nd president, right? Those aren't really distinct. Those are just simply things that when we think about it in our mind, but virtual distinction is that we want to say the words actually tell us something different about the thing, right? So Thomists want to seem to say, as I understand it, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, then when we call God loving and we call him just, within God, those are really the same thing, but that the words aren't necessarily telling us the same thing about God within our mind, because they're still virtually distinct from one another. That's how is that a good description?
Yeah, it's like I remember I had Christopher Tomaszewski on, who's I would say a quite faithful Thomist, if not, one of the best. But the point that he made, and I agree, I think you did a fair characterization, but I'll just add a little bit, is that like with the virtual distinction, it's that he uses this term of art where it's like the thing itself, in order to be understood properly, lends itself to a distinction in the mind or the intellect, even though in actuality it is all one and the same in the object of knowledge. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yeah. And so then you have within the real distinctions, this distinction between a weak real distinction and a strong real distinction, that a weak real distinction, these two things aren't actually separable, but that they're not the same thing. The two terms can't actually be reduced to each other in the thing itself. And then in the strong real distinction, the two things are actually separable. Is that correct?
Oh, with the strong and the weak one, I'm not too familiar with actually that one.
Okay. Yeah. Ed Feser lays it out. It seems like some later Thomists want to basically say the strong real distinction is the only actual real distinction. And there seems like there's some discussion among Thomists about that. But anyways, I think the issue you'll have in a lot of Thomists is when I read their accounts of the virtual distinction and the weak real distinction, and their arguments for why one thing, like for example, that rationality and animality, those to me seem like really separable concepts. And so it seems to me that that should really be the weak real distinction and not the virtual distinction. But then there's also arguments it should be the virtual distinction. And so we have an issue here that it seems really hard to classify whether one should fall into one or the other. And I think Scotus solves this with the formal distinction, which sort of folds these two together into a new distinction. And so in the formal distinction, two things, they aren't identical to one another, they're not reducible to one another, but they're not separable from one another. So take, for example, the functions of the mind, right? This is actually, I think Augustine draws out really well, that you have, right, the mind as memory, the mind as intellect, and the mind as will. That intellect, memory, and will are not reducible to one another. But I also don't think we can say simply that they're simply accidents of the mind, that each one seems like for Augustine, that they're in some sense radically identified with the mind itself. And these are the mind in three different modes of operation, in the mode of memory, in the mode of intellect, and in the mode of will. And I think that that's a really good illustration of the formal distinction here, that all three can in some sense be identified with a thing, but they're not reducible to one another. So, right, so when we say that God is just and God is loving, we want to say that even within God, they're not really reducible to one another. Because if they were really reducible in God to one another, they wouldn't actually have different meanings beyond simply perhaps different causes of God, but that they within God wouldn't really have different meanings. And Scotus wants to say that even within God, they have different meanings, but that they're also both identified with God. So Scotus says that all of the divine attributes and the divine ideas are the divine essence, but that each of them is then not reducible to one another.
Okay, and so he does that through the formal distinction, whereas a Thomist would say, the Thomist would kind of say the opposite, right? Which is that they are reducible down to the same substance at bottom, but it's only kind of conceptually speaking, we need to make that distinction in order to make sense of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think Scotus is really heavily here drawing on Anselm and Anselm's idea of the pure perfections. So Anselm lays out that there's sort of two different ways we can talk about God. We can talk about God in relation, so how he causes things or that he's superior to things. These are things we can only talk about in relation. But there's also seems to be things we can talk about God apart from relation, like that God is wise. What does it mean for God to be wise? It's not simply that he causes wisdom within things, but that he has an infinite wisdom while we have a finite wisdom. And so here we have, this is why I want to talk about univocity first, because we have here this disjunct between finite wisdom and infinite wisdom, that we don't really know what it means to know all things in one singular act, right? And know them distinctly from one another. We don't really know what that means. So we can talk about it analogically to how we know things, but that there is this underlying similarness between our wisdom and God's wisdom. And so Scotus wants to say then, right, that if that's the case, then there really has to be in God, these pure perfections can't all be reducible to one another. So the wisdom of God, then, if it's really a wisdom of God and not simply a causing of wisdom, then it must not be the same of love if God's love is not simply a cause of love, but is actually a love within himself. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so I can already kind of sense what the ramifications would be for the doctrine of divine simplicity, but could you just spell that out anyway?
Yeah, so I think the important thing to remember for divine simplicity here is that Scotus isn't denying the doctrine of divine simplicity. He's not saying we have a bunch of separable parts in God. He's not even saying that, but not saying it at the same time. So I get the sense in some Palamites that they sort of want to say it and not say it at the same time. So they want to talk about the energies of God and the essence of God as though they're really two separate things. But then if you push them on, oh, well, no, they're not separable. But that's, at that point, you don't really have divine simplicity anymore. Even if I can't pull them apart, they're still really at this point two separate things. But Scotus isn't saying they're two separate things. When he talks about the attributes of God being formally distinct from the essence, what he's saying simply is these are different formalities of the one same essence, and that they're all identical to the essence and not identical to each other. And this is really a hard idea to wrap our minds around. It's easier with physical things, and that's why I think it's easier to start off there. But because of course we're only talking analogically here about God, it's really hard to grasp our mind around it. But I think we don't have to deny divine simplicity here, because we're still saying that God is one, that God, all of these are identical with the divine essence, and that there really only is the divine essence, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So then what would actually be the difference then between the Thomistic virtual distinction and the Scotist formal distinction?
Yeah, I think the difference is that we're saying that this distinction exists prior to the mind's conception of it.
Right. Okay.
And so that's why it might get us accused by some Thomists of denying divine simplicity, because they would say that that falls into the weak real distinction here, and that we're now within real distinctions. But I think my response to that would sort of be that so many things that get thrown into the virtual distinction by Thomists should really be under the weak virtual distinction, except that they don't want to say that. So I have a hard time, at least when the examples I read from Thomists, of really distinguishing between the virtual distinction and the weak real distinction. And I think throwing these together in a common category of the formal distinction really helps us sort of sort this out.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a neater metaphysical picture.
I think so, yeah. I think with any of these, when we're talking about distinctions within God, I don't really know if in this life we can really come up with the perfect system to figure it all out. You know, I think whatever system we're going to have is going to have some logical issues, because we're working with it on this finite side of this disjunct here.
Yeah, I mean, like, and when you talked about how the divine attributes are identical to the essence, but they are distinct from each other, that kind of reminded me of the doctrine of the Trinity, right, to some extent. So I'm wondering, I mean, obviously you don't want to say that the Trinitarian persons are only formally distinct from each other, right?
Yeah.
Well, you want to affirm that they are really distinct persons, right? That the Father, when we refer to the Father, we're not referring to the Son, and when we refer to the Son, we're not referring to the Spirit, right? So can you talk to me about that?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely the case, but you still have to have a real distinction there. I've seen some Scotists sort of flirt with maybe this should be a formal distinction, but I think dogmatically we have to affirm that that's a real distinction. There's some people who like, I think, to flirt with Scotism because they sort of think it's a way for them to be able to come up with unorthodox conclusions and act like they're orthodox. Unfortunately, I think that the Scotist tradition as a whole sometimes gets accused of that. I don't think that's fair. But I think here within the Trinity, what's I going to say? These are still really distinct persons, right? So I think the relations of begetting and procession The fathers are clear that we can't know what beginning and procession are. These are only within the mind of God. These are analogical. We only talk about them analogically. And so I think whatever beginning and procession are that we can't know of because we're finite, those must not be the same thing. And what Scotus talks about in his Trinitarian theology is that each of the persons of the Trinity is an infinite being, but they're also only one infinite being. And so Scotus's discussion of infinity, I think actually for both these things, Scotus's discussion of infinity is very important because he doesn't merely take that infinity is to not be limited. He takes infinity is to be beyond any finite thing. There's a really positive conception of infinity here. And so, right, that if each person is absolutely infinite, and I'm saying absolutely infinite here, I'm sort of signaling to anyone here who knows mathematics, that in modern mathematics, there's a distinction between sort of this numeric infinity and an absolute infinity. And I actually think this is really wonderful that modern mathematics has come up with a great way to discuss Scotism in this. I think Scotus came up with it before them, but anyways, that you have here, right, that each person, even if they're absolutely infinite, that they don't exhaust the absolute infinite essence, but they are also fully that essence. So each of them can be fully that essence, but also another person can be fully that essence, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the big distinction too is that, you know, when you talked about the formal distinction and the divine attributes, right? I mean, the persons aren't attributes of God. And so you could just make a sharp distinction there and be like, yeah, okay, so there's maybe a phonetic similarity between both sentences, right? But it's not like referring to the same thing. Yeah.
And to bring up the Palamite issue here, I bring that up a bunch just because I used to be a very sort of hardcore Palamite, so that's how I often compare things that you get in a lot of Palamite readings, a sort of depersonalization of the energies, where the energies sort of become a whole bunch more hypostases, and that the persons of the Trinity sort of become less important then. I think the smarter Palamites realize there has to be this that a person is the one who acts, and so there has to be a relationship between the persons and the energies. But I think we have to be careful then, basically here, not to hypostasize the attributes or activities of God.
Yeah, and could you unravel that a bit more? Yeah,
that right. Well, what it means to be a person, right? A person acts, they are a full being, right? In themselves, they're a being. But so we have three beings that are also one being. But within the attributes, it's not as though these attributes are beings, right? They're still identified with the divine essence in that sense. Does that make sense?
Hopefully, yeah. I'm interested too in just maybe this can be the last question I ask you, which is, you know, you already talked a little bit about it, but I kind of want to see if you have any more thoughts on how, you know, the philosophy of John Duns Scotus helped you with Palamism, right? Yeah.
So I highly recommend to go on Reason and Theology and watch the interviews with Jared Goff there, because I think he explains it much better. But I think we can have here that Palamas's main concern here is that within each energy, the divine essence is fully present, but that the energy doesn't exhaust the essence. It's not by knowing the energy that we then know the essence. He wants to say that the essence still remains fully transcendent here. And I think that this solves the issue within Scotism, that Scotism, I think, cuts a neat middle ground between Thomism and Palamism, that it has the issues that the Palamites are concerned with, that each activity of God can't simply exhaust the essence, but also really strongly preserve divine simplicity in a way that the Thomists are concerned with, and that the Palamites might flirt a little too closely to denying divine simplicity in anything but name, you know. And so I think that Scotism works as this neat middle ground. And I think theologically, Scotism also takes in the absolute primacy of Christ, which is really central to a lot of Byzantine theology, and works that in. So I think it's able to take in those important Byzantine theological conclusions and show that they're fully orthodox within them. And then you'll then see how Scotus works from the absolute primacy of Christ to the Immaculate Conception, and see that Palamites should affirm the Immaculate Conception as well if they follow through with that same logic as Palamos himself did, and he affirmed the Immaculate Conception. I highly recommend the work of Father Christian Capes on that.
Well, thank you to the Byzantine Scotus for coming on to my show today. I really enjoyed talking to you about the philosophy of John Duns Scotus. And I also appreciate how, for me, as someone who has been trained more in the Thomistic tradition, hearing you kind of articulate that you're trying to find a middle ground, so to speak, and that, Scotus is often misunderstood, or he's kind of pulled out as the boogeyman, so to speak, right? But now you're saying like, no, there's something more here, right? And so, tell us more about where we can find your work. I know that you recently started a YouTube channel. Is it a podcast? You have a blog?
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel. You can also find me on Twitter. I'm at Bizcat, BYZCAT. My Twitter is much less formal. It's sort of whatever my hot takes are. So you get to see a lot more of my political views and stuff. There's sort of whatever I'm thinking of off the top of my head and I want to talk about gets thrown up there. And these are sort of the two main spots you can find me at. I upload videos weekly on my YouTube channel. I've been alternating between two series. So half the time I'm talking about Scotism. The other half the time I'm talking about biblical symbolisms. I'm very interested in that and responding especially to Jewish objections to Christianity since I came from that background.
Yeah, so I need to get you on sometime to talk about biblical symbolism and to talk about your journey, because you have a really interesting story about how you became Catholic. And so I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. I had a good time talking with you here. I've been a big fan of your work for a while.
Thank you.